Welcome to At Home at Highclere for Viking, and this is episode 6, so thank you so much for joining us on May the 8th. And May the 8th, of course, was VE Day in Europe, so I wanted to bring you all down to this Cedar Airman, which is an airman we've created to commemorate all the airmen who died here during World War II. We actually unveiled him in 2018 when we commemorated the end of the First World War. And again, it's something which we're working with today because it's 75 years ago, 3 days ago, that a B-17 with 7 young American men crashed into the hill behind Highclere Castle. May the 5th, 1945, 3 days before the end of the war in Europe. It was such a sad, terrible tragedy, and it was one of pure accident. They were flying on a training exercise. Unlike today, when it's a beautiful sunny day, it was more like a week ago when it was pouring with rain, low crowd and fog. And they came down in this extraordinary, huge engine of this plane. Everybody heard it circling twice over the castle as the airmen were trying to find their way towards Greenham Common, which is 7 miles away, or another airbase. And sadly, they then turned and flew south into the fog, and also into the only high hill around here, at about 900 foot above sea level. They tried to pull up to get past it, but sadly didn't. I found out about the remains of the B-17 and this story when I was finishing writing a book called Lady Catherine, The Real Downton Abbey, which took Highclere through the 20s and 30s, the Downton Abbey time, and then into the Second World War. I loved writing it, but at the end was the beginning of my journey, finding the stories of these airmen. Not merely was there a B-17 that crashed, I have since found, with the help of a wonderful man called Steve Bohill-Smith and Paul McTaggart, who's standing here with me, the remains of 7 other planes. And the airmen flying in them, the aircrew, they were sons, they were brothers, they were husbands, and most of the families never knew where their loved ones had died. So it has been one of our missions to try and find the families and to, if you like, reunite them with what happened at the end so they can come and pay their remembrances, and we can all say thank you to them. So this cedar airman is carved from a cedar tree which came down some years ago. We saved the trunk, and it was carved in one entire go. There's nothing added on. This is his knapsack, and it's by a man called Simon O'Rourke. And it's beautiful and weathering with age, and will long outlast anything we as mankind can make, far longer than any metal or any bronze cast. He's just going to grow into the ground and grow with age and time. And he's looking back at all of us, because he was excited. He was going to climb into his Ferrari in the sky and fly off like Lieutenant Stewart, who was also crashed into the Bluebell Woods up there in a P-38. So he was going to climb into his amazing plane, which he loved. But they didn't come back. So in the remains of, underneath the benches behind me, are the remains of some of their planes. And we found the stories and what became of the planes, to try to bring them here so we can say their names out loud and say thank you. So it's a fantastic carving, which I'm always very fond of, and around it are masses of flowers, cowslips, camassia, and an extraordinary field of cowslips. So he's in a very beautiful place, facing the hills in which so many of the planes died, and then but standing here for all of you to come and meet him. One of the people who has been with me on this journey for the last few years, finding the stories, finding the planes, is Paul. And when I first met Paul, he didn't work at Highclere, but he was a friend, through a friend of mine, Steve, he was a metal detector. So I needed someone to help me find the remains, which was more than I could do. So there's 3 of us, Steve Bohill-Smith, who used to fly Concorde, was a British Airways pilot, Paul McTaggart and myself. And we've set off on different days to go and see what we can find in the woods, to ask those who've lived here since that time for their memories, and then to go back into computers and Google, which is amazing in these times, to try and find the stories and then the families. Paul, it has been an amazing journey, hasn't it?
It really has been amazing. So since that time, since Steve came to me in the Flowerpots pub, which is our local pub, said, "I've got a special job for you. I can't tell you what it's about, but it's in a special place. You'll find out tomorrow." And I came here, and this special job was to find this B-17 Flying Fortress.
And you've kindly brought out from inside the castle some of the things that we've since found, haven't you?
Yeah, well, the most treasured thing for me would be the radio compass, because Flight Lieutenant Robert Sprout would have been looking at this as he flew over, and it shows you the last contact he had, which was just there before the plane hit the hill. So it's important, this little thing. It tells you exactly, that's the only thing we have inside the cockpit. But many of the other things are from other aircraft. This beautiful compass comes from a Proctor, which crashed here, and it came from Worthy Down.
Can you remember when the Proctor crashed?
I think it was the 5th of February 1942.
Right. That was a training plane, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was on a training mission. It was the instructor was he was training a student to learn to fly, and then they had an engine problem, and they had to land in one of the fields, and sadly he was killed. The student, yeah, he survived, but the instructor died.
So we have in fact got quite a lot of the remains of different planes under license, may I add, from the MOD. In order to save them, and from time to time we've created exhibitions, haven't we, to tell some of the stories of these extraordinary men and share their family stories as well. So over the hill above us, there are masses of pieces of the B-17. It was fully laden with fuel and ammunition, so when it crashed, the whole thing exploded. Terrible last few minutes. But one man, actually, Len Nitti, survived, and his 7 colleagues, his band of brothers, sadly died, and he came back here. So some of the stories known from his personal experience. He's died since. He lived till he was about 94, I think.
Yeah, he died in 2018. There's a film he came back with his family to make up on the hill to look for parts of the aircraft, and he found bits of plexiglass, which is from the aircraft's windows. And he treasured this little piece of glass, and he took it home with him back to his home in America. And we still find bits and pieces lying around. And this is the real sort of story I love, because they looked through this bit of glass when they were going along.
The B-17 was a flying fortress. I know there's a Lysander. There's the story of 2 Mosquitoes, which crashed into the hill the other side. There was a Proctor. There was a Whitley, wasn't there?
Yeah, there is, yeah.
Terribly cumbersome plane to fly, which was flown by a New Zealand man, Robert Hewitt. Mm-hmm. And were there any other planes? I forgot.
There was 2 P-38s.
Oh, P-38s, that was
the 2 P-38s, which was the Thomas D. Stewart. He crashed in the grounds. It was a mid-air collision, and the other aircraft crashed at Ashmansworth, which was about 3 miles that way. It's all very sad.
But Lieutenant Stewart's plane went down 10,000 feet straight into a bluebell wood, and it was very difficult to get out of it in those days, the way the plane was built, and the P-38 and ejector cabin as well. So it's been incredibly moving, and we've had services to mark their graves. And anyway, VE Day is a day to say thank you, both now and in the future, isn't it?
It certainly is.
May the 8th, 75 years, but I hope he'll be here for another 250 years.
Long after we've gone, I'm thinking.
Yes. Thank you so much, Paul, for all your help and for joining us here today.
Thank you.
So welcome back inside the castle on this 6th episode on VE Day. So here I am sitting in the morning room at the Highclere Castle. Less familiar to you perhaps if you watch Downton Abbey. It was used sometimes by Maggie Smith as a room to rest in between some of the shoots that she was doing. But I love this room. It's sunny, it's south-facing, and on the walls are all my predecessors as Countesses of Carnarvon here. So it's a very important room to me. But today I wanted to recap and share with you some of the stories about what happened to Highclere in World War II before moving to VE Day. So in September 1939, Highclere Castle was requisitioned by the Ministry of Health and it became a home for evacuee children from North London. Can you imagine? They were 3, 4, 5 years old, and they were all put on a bus with their teachers and nursing assistants, and they came here to this huge castle, which was soon blacked out. Enormous, probably quite cold in the winter. And think of their mothers who had to let them go. In fact, some of them couldn't bear to see them go and came back to collect their children to live with them. London was, of course, very badly bombed, so we don't know quite where the story went. We can only hope. And if your grandparents as well, think of your grandchildren, 3 and 4 and 5 years old, being taken away from their families to live on the top floor of this house. I hope they had some good times here as well. I hope the nursing staff were kind to them, I'm sure they were. We've got some drawings in the archives from some of the evacuee children. They called the 6th Earl of Carnarvon at the time King Carnarvon, because a king must live in a castle. And they lived here throughout the Second World War. When they were 5 years old, they were fostered out to local families as more young children came out to join here. The family lived on the 1st floor, the children tended to live on the 2nd floor. And you can see in one of the photographs, which I know will come up during this little talk, that they slept on fairly basic beds on some of the bedrooms on the top floor. They were sharing baths. There was quite a lot of food here. There was a dairy farm, there was some pheasants and partridge and rabbits to eat. There was a big kitchen garden, and it was digging for victory, the land girls here. And so that was their life. They were schooled in the dining rooms. The dining room became their schoolroom. And about 1943, all their beds were brought down and they put up cots in the library, which is very familiar to you from Downton Abbey. And the children stayed in the library because the Germans were often dropping some of their bombs on their way back from bombing Bristol, and then they'd come across the South Downs at Highclere to go head towards the Channel, and they wanted to lighten their payloads. So there were so many alarms that the children's cots were put in the library. The nursing assistants were with them the whole time. They had a few days off, but not many every month. And there are some lovely photographs of them, and some of them climbed to the top of the tower and scrawled their names into the lead roofs up there. So we've got some memories of them, and some of their daughters or grandchildren have sent us in photographs, which is what you're able to see today. In the meantime, the 6th Earl of Carnarvon found a job in Southern Command, and his son, who became the 7th Earl, was obviously a teenager, going to school, coming back here for the holidays, and living here with his cousin, Patricia. His sister was actually sent away for safety to school in America, to the east coast of America. But I thought that was such a scary journey across the Atlantic, but nevertheless, that's where she went to stay with her American relatives. Her brother, however, stayed here, went riding with his father sometimes in the holidays. And then when he was just past 18, he left school, and then he joined the army. So here was a young teenager, and his mother Catherine was both proud of him as he won the Sword of Honour at Sandhurst, and also so anxious as he joined the war effort and went firstly to North Africa, and then secondly to join the war fighting in Italy. A really dangerous war with lots of bombs built into villages and left behind as booby traps. But he obviously survived. So it was an extraordinary time, and then as we moved towards 1945, I was able to tell the last couple of years because Geordie's father used to write letters home to his father here, and he would write letters and reply. So all those letters were preserved, and it was such an insight when I was trying to write a book, Lady Catherine, about the wartime here. It was absolutely fascinating, and as a researcher and writer you feel so fortunate. In April 1945, after Geordie's father had returned from Italy, but before the war ended, there was a really happy moment when his sister got married. She got married here from Highclere. One of the first Carnarvons to marry from Highclere, because normally it was a society wedding in London. But London was not safe. The Germans were still dropping bombs on London right to the very end. So they married at Highclere. She married a man who was commissioned into the army. And there's one of my favourite photographs is Almina, the grandmother, of the 6th Earl and Countess, and just behind them, Geordie's father. So it's a moment of happiness in April, as just before we head towards May the 8th, 1945, and VE Day. One of the reasons that I began outside was because at the very end of the book I wrote, Catherine, which I so enjoyed writing, the books you absorb you and they become your life for the time that you're writing them, and each book takes me a couple of years to write. And just before I handed the book into the publishers, I was told a story. The head keeper, Eddie, told me, "Do you know about the B-17, my lady, in the hills?" I had no idea about any B-17 in the hills. But he'd been here, he'd worked actually here for 60 years now. So he had the legacy of the stories from the Second World War. And that began my journey to find that a B-17 had indeed crashed into the hills behind Highclere, as we described. And we didn't know about it, I didn't know about it, and I didn't know if the families knew about it. So that's why I began to find out, and with the help of an amazing man, Jeff Pickett, who I met by chance, and we were talking together as usual. So much happens, in fact, over a cup of tea and scones, and he's helped me find some of the families of those extraordinary, courageous men who died on Sidon Hill on May the 5th, 1945. So it's been such a meaningful journey for me, and from the B-17 and some of the remains of what we found, I then found another 7 planes had crashed here at Highclere. Again, families didn't necessarily know whether husbands, sons or brothers had died, and it led to the creation of the statue of the Cedar Airmen. So it's not just about the B-17, it's about all 8 planes, and it sort of stands for all the airmen who we know who perished and died in so many of the training accidents in World War II. So this wasn't under enemy fire, it was just through training accidents. And it has in fact been such an extraordinary journey to meet all these people, to put together exhibitions about what happened to the planes and the families. And then from there we've also reached out to support an American charity called TAPS. And this is actually about supporting bereaved American military families today, of which there are some 90,000. They came over and joined us in 2018, as did some of the B-17 families, and we created an exhibition and we remembered them and said thank you. 2018 was the end of the First World War, obviously. We wanted to remember and again say thank you. And whilst we look back at history, the point of it is always to raise money for those who serve and save today. And I'm so sad that that's not what we're able to do today. And I hope in some ways we can roll forward our thoughts and some of our plans into October, when we're going to create a little history festival here, both virtual and real, and share the stories and put together some great speakers and reenactments, bring up the cars, the planes, the dancing and the music, and say thank you again. And I hope to raise money for those who serve and save. So that's really been our strapline through all the events. And apart from TAPS, which is a great charity, and it's been an honour to get to know them and work with them, and Bonnie and Diana, my contacts over there, we've also raised money here for Médecins Sans Frontières, which is something my husband and I, Geordie, hugely support, Doctors Without Borders. So they are going into the places we are running away from, giving all the support they can, and never is it more needed, perhaps, than today. And our own charity, SAFA, which again helps all the serving forces. We sometimes help mental health through combat stress, and in other times, in fact, this VE Day, we were going to raise the profile of the mental support that our National Health Service offer veterans. So that's a collection of charities reaching across oceans. Médecins Sans Frontières was started in Belgium, in mainland Europe. So by bringing it all together, it's about collaboration and partnership and helping others. So that is the story of VE Day and the history of Catherine coming through. On VE Day, as we all know, at 3 p.m, Winston Churchill made the announcement the war had come to an end. And VE Day, May the 8th, turned into such a celebration through all the major cities that VE Day in Europe had finished. It hadn't yet finished for the war in the Pacific. It was another two or 3 months until August the 15th, which is VJ Day. And during the London celebrations, everybody ran through the streets, the Congo celebrated. It must have been the most extraordinary party of all parties. And they hoped the end of war, the end of all wars, I'd imagine they hoped. One of the people running through the streets and celebrating was Geordie's father, still in uniform, and he was one of the few men who had gone inside Buckingham Palace, and Princess Elizabeth, the Queen, and Princess Margaret had also wanted to go and celebrate. So the two princesses and Geordie's father, known as Lord Porchester, and some other friends and Margaret Rhodes ran through the streets of London doing the Congo dancing, and it must have been the most extraordinary evening. They were all in uniform, they were all wearing their caps properly, they were trying to pass unnoticed. I suspect some might have noticed Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret, but what an amazing evening and a way to end the war. So VE Day today is a very special day, and I hope in October we can come back, as I said, to raise money and think of those people and say thank you. And I think it's even more poignant for what we're all going through today. I hope we'll have some planes in the sky, and with all that we're learning with the virtual television, with the help, virtual streaming with the help of Viking, I hope we can again share it in a much wider way. We've got some great historians such as Robert Harris who've agreed to take part, who are publishing books about the end of the Second World War, so I thought it's very relevant. And then on the Sunday we thought we'd just switch into talking about the landscape and the gardens and the landscape that's created here of so much beauty. So it's about natural history, from VE Day to natural history. So I hope some of you might consider joining us then, or if you can't join us in person, you can join us online. And perhaps if my wonderful cameraman might just swing it round so you can see the painting of Catherine in this room. My husband's very beautiful grandmother on the front of my book, and a very special and good lady who lived through the Second World War in London. It was not easy. And her husband, as you would find out, went to the Battle of Norway, but it's rather a sad and tragic story. And next door to his Almina, the 5th Countess, who was the one who created the hospital here in the First World War. So I'm lucky, I followed some great predecessors, and I hope Geordie and I try to do our part as well, play our roles. Very suitable language given Downton Abbey. I hope you've enjoyed some of the stories from the Second World War, and I'm looking forward to answering some of your questions, of which there are many. And just so you know, I'm joined by 2 dogs today. Stella, who's down by my feet. You want to stand up, Stella? You want to come up here? Can you get up? Good girl. So this is Stella, and her mummy Finza is with Karina Harden. And then this is Alfie, who actually they both appear. Alfie appears in the 2 books, Finza of Downton Abbey, which for light relief is what Karina and I thoroughly enjoy writing. And they travel all around the world, don't you, darling, on lots of Viking cruises. And I write about afternoon tea with little recipes and other stories about living at Highclere. So Alfie is this one, Stella's uncle, and he has a predilection for going on walks himself rather than with me, and disappearing off to find the nearest bin, and being remarkably deaf and not hearing, "Hey, where we go, aren't you?" But he is the most lovely boy. He was the darkest of the litter, and actually the runt of the litter. And it's his sister Finza who lives now with Karina. So do you want to sit down now? Good boy, thank you very much. So I'm looking forward to answer some questions. So behind the camera, do you have some questions, Kat, for me?
Thank you so much, Lady Carnarvon. So first we have a question from Elizabeth in Maryland. She asks, did the planes crash on the return of their missions, or did they run out of fuel?
Do you know, every single plane that crashed here crashed through some tragic accident. The B-17 was on a training mission. It was just taking some of the pilots from one place to another. And it was really, instead of the beautiful weather of today, which would have been amazing for our VE Day celebrations, it is ironic. It was thick rain and mist. And when the plane circled over Highclere looking for which way to go, and the pilots were less experienced with all the navigation instruments, they'd flown as a convoy within sight. They sadly set off south. And the only direction around the castle, which has a high hill, is south. And they flew in that direction, and as the hill loomed up, they tried to pull the plane up and they tried to get away from it. But the trees on the top of the hill are also really tall, and they clipped it, and the plane just tumbled and broke into fire and flame. It was just so sad. The more you read about it, it just makes you cry. 2 de Havilland mosquitoes were again, the pilots and them were learning to fly, and they didn't pull up in time over another hill to the south. There was something called Bombing Alley here, and that's where many of the pilots and other RAF trained. They were training young pilots for battle later, but in training they so died. A Lysander, which was practicing shooting out spotlights, because it was dropping many of the double agents behind the lines in France. It needed a short takeoff and landing, and it needed to extinguish any spotlights to try to escape undetected. But it extinguished the spotlight it was practicing to shoot at, and sadly went into the bank of another hill, and so on. The stories are so similar and so sad, but in a way, with the statues to see around them and their names, we can say their names, the stories are there, and we can say their names out loud and say thank you, and I think that matters.
Thank you. We now have a question from Kathleen in San Bruno. She says that your gardens are so beautiful and asks, have you ever planted Californian poppies? If not, I will send some to you.
Well, thank you so much. I haven't planted Californian poppies that I know of, and I would love to plant some. Funnily enough, Geordie, my husband, and I were going to plant some Indian paintbrush flowers, which in memory of my mother-in-law, who was American, so it'd be lovely to add to our collection of American plants. Thank you.
We now have a question from Kimberly in Oakland. She asks, what's your favourite story about Lady Catherine?
Kimberly, thank you for asking. My favourite story about Catherine is, I think of her as someone who loved life. She loved to dance. She loves to play the piano, to sing. She must have brought such gaiety and fun to all the parties that she and her husband, the 6th Earl, threw here. So I think of that light side of her. I think of how she began her life at a spectacular, beautiful wedding in London in 1922. And then as you follow her through the 20s and the 30s, which were harder and tougher for her, and then into the Second World War, I think you see the cycle of all our lives. So I think it's following her journey through. But I'm glad I got to know her a little bit from the stories of Geordie, who knew her really well.
Thank you. So now we have a question from Laura in Sunnyvale. She says, Alfie is so adorable. How old is he?
Thank you. Alfie is adorable, and he's very fond of licking me, aren't you, Alfie? And he's now completely exhausted, and I suppose he's resting before he goes on his next bin hunt. In fact, he only just made it into the filming room because he disappeared looking for bins in offices around the castle, and then he can shut himself in different rooms. So he had a moment of unpopularity. But I think he's going to be 8 in September, which is really scary. Or it could be 7. Do you know, I try not to think about age, my own or the dog's.
Thank you. So we now have another animal-related question from Dorothy in Southport. She asks, is there any chance of meeting the horses in a future episode?
That's a lovely idea, Dorothy from Southport. I would love to perhaps begin one of our Friday evenings out with my husband, who helps. He's the assistant mucker outer of the thoroughbred mares and foals at weekends. So that would be a lovely thing to do, and I think we can film him and Maggie, our groom, working really hard. So great idea. They are adorable. They're such fun, and they're so uplifting. It's all full of new life, isn't it? And they're sort of 2 months old now, but they have such strength and such interest and curiosity in life.
We now have a question from Dennis in Washington. He asks, during World War II, did the castle take any hits from any bombs?
Thank you for the question, Dennis, living in Washington, about whether the castle was bombed in World War II. In fact, there were no direct hits. There was some machine gun strafing which went through the windows. They're sort of Gothic windows above the main staircase, which, if you've watched Downton Abbey, you will definitely have seen Michel Docker, a Hugh Bonneville, walk down. A huge bomb was dropped near London Lodge, which is one of the entrances to the estate, and that made an enormous indentation. And apparently it knocked out a lot of windows in the nearby buildings. I think they heard it, but that was all. And very sadly, a schoolgirl was killed in the playground outside the school, which is near Highclere Church. She was just caught by a ricocheting bullet. But there was no closer direct hits here, but extraordinary times.
Thank you, Lady Carnarvon. We now have a question from Susan in Florida. She asks, how many families have you been able to contact with regard to the missing airmen?
Thank you, Susan, and from Florida. We have, I think, found quite a few of the families. Those are the B-17, which is entirely due to the efforts of Jeff, who I mentioned earlier, and his team. And then we found the family of Lieutenant Stewart, who crashed in a P-38 just 2 weeks before D-Day, 1944, actually because I wrote a blog about it, and they found his name on my blog. And they came to us, they came over, and it was very moving. We've put a gravestone in the woods where each of the planes crashed and the men died. And our vicar came up, and there was about 10 of us, and we held a church service there. And Jessica, who was from his family, and her son were there, who's 16. And it was a very moving service, and Jessica asked if she could sing a hymn, and of course she could sing a hymn. And she and her son sang this beautiful hymn in this glade with bluebells underfoot and with birds nesting in the trees, and I think all of us were hard put to hold back our tears. It was an amazing moment. We found some of the other families, and the Daily Mail actually is offering, I think, at some point to help us find the remaining family members, which should be simply wonderful to offer them a chance to come here and to gather here, and perhaps that's what I can work towards on October the 10th, when we have our History Festival, and again gather to think of what WWII Day meant, and to take it forward into the aftermath of it, what it led to in the succeeding years.
Debbie from Roswell, I guess, adds to this and thanks you for honouring all of our soldiers.
Well, you're very kind. It is, I think, it's for whatever country, and that's why we gather charities from different countries, because every person matters to someone, don't they?
Now we have a question from Anita in Santa Monica. Will we ever get to see the view from the tower?
Anita from Santa Monica, thank you for the question about how we can see the view from the tower. Actually, I think if you download our app, quick call out to download the app, you can see a virtual tour from the tower, which we did do. And we completely forgot we'd created this app, so please do have a look at it. It's quite easy to find. It's actually narrated by Jim Carson. So that is one way of seeing it. And it would be very nice to go up there and actually perhaps have a gin cocktail after having made it all the way upstairs. Our challenge, as ever, in this castle is something called Wi-Fi. It's very hard to find and to be strong enough in order to stream for all of you to see.
Thank you. We now have a question from Nancy, who is asking, have you ever written a book about your gardens?
Well, Nancy, thank you very much. The gardens are in many of the books that I write as scenes when I set the characters walking or create a scene in my mind. And Christmas at Highclere had some of the winter gardens in, and that's going to be one of the topics for one of my next books. So we are now trying to photograph the different moments and seasons, and when I have agreed the title with the publishers, Viking will be the first to know.
Thank you. We now have a question from Debbie in New York. Have there ever been any reunions of the children who stayed here during the war?
I would love to find out how I could contact the children, the evacuees who were here. I don't know. It would be lovely to welcome them here and see if they kept in contact with any of their friends from the time. They were very small then, so I don't know how many of you would have kept in touch with the children you knew when you were 3 or 4 or 5 years old. So, but perhaps they might know some of the names. It's a good way. Perhaps I need to turn to the newspapers again for help.
Thank you. Lady Carnarvon, we now have a question from Irene in Tamarack. Is the statue of the airmen open to the public?
Thank you. The statue of the airmen is in the lawns, so everybody who comes to Highclere can go and see it. And actually, Paul has started to do 2 or 3 talks a day when we're open to the public to share some of the stories so people know why it's there. And it's been incredibly popular. I think we're going to make some more benches so we can spread more people out, but I think it's a lovely thing to share, and again it's outside and we have space here, so I hope in that way we'll be able to share some of our outside space as the world moves on and out of this challenging and terrible time we're in at the moment.
Marguerite from Halethorpe adds to this, thanking you for honouring our brave men. America appreciates it. And she also adds, thank you, Paul, for all your hard work.
Yes, no, Paul McTaggart and Steve Bohill-Smith is the other person. There's a trio of us who go on plane searches. In fact, I know we have 1 plane yet to find, but it takes a bit of time, and it's always best looking for it in the winter, because there's less undergrowth and less nettles to get stung by. But thank you.
We now have a question from Kim, who is in New Jersey. You've touched on this before, but she's asking, who are the women in the paintings behind you?
Kim in New Jersey, thank you for the question. The larger painting with the lady with a pale green background and dress is Catherine, is Julie, my husband's grandmother. It's a beautiful painting and one of my favourites in the castle. Obviously, I think the painter was in love with her, and in fact she had 13 proposals of marriage before Portia, the 6th Earl, finally persuaded her to accept his proposal. She was a very good woman, and funny enough, when I was writing about her, it's quite hard to write about good people. So that was a different sort of challenge. And next door to her, the smaller painting, is a painting of Almina, her mother-in-law, the 5th Countess. Not very tall, and an indomitable woman. In many ways, a woman ahead of her time, a woman who had the money to follow a vocation and to nurse and to turn the castle hospital. She was a very wealthy heiress, and that gave her the courage and the confidence to take the steps she wanted to do. So she was an amazing lady, Amina, but so was Catherine, and so was my mother-in-law.
Thank you. I think this will be our final question this evening from Betty in Colonia. Who built Highclere Castle and when?
Well, Betty, that's quite a long question. That's quite a short question with a long answer. This latest version was commissioned by the 3rd Earl of Carnarvon, and he commissioned Sir Charles Barry, who was created the House of Parliament, to clad the very nice gentleman's residence, a Georgian house, which he'd inherited, and turn it into this magnificent, inspirational, Gothic-inspired, Italianate castle. However, within the castle, within the Georgian house, there's an Elizabethan house, there's a medieval abbey, and our earliest records of a building of a home here, of the foundations of a home on which this home is built, are 749 AD. So this home is 1200 years old. And my husband's family have owned it 350 years, and before them the house was owned by the church, by the bishops of Winchester. So it's had two owners for 1200 years. And for most of that time it's been in business of some sort, and it's found its resilience and its way forward. So that's what I hope we will again do today. And it's taking this extraordinary antique building and now working with Viking to make it a kind of virtual home and to share stories. Working with our gin to create a Highclere Castle gin and cocktail parties, to do different sorts of streaming, to put out a gift shop online which sells the Finzer books, so do have a look for them. Actually, and Stella and her sister Frey have not yet made an appearance, so perhaps that's one of the next books that Karina and I need to write about Finzer and her children, actually. So I want to say thank you so much for joining me this evening, and there's a link for the app, for Highclere Castle app, on the Viking website, so do have a look. And I'm looking forward very much to seeing you next Friday, and I think we're going to be in the music room, which is a beautiful painted room, although I think we may again start outside. Thank you so much, and may I wish you well on VE Day, and I'm looking forward to listening to the Queen on television a little bit later. So thank you.